Oh, cool. In which case, I guess we can kind of get started. Before we do, I was having a debate with the AV guy before. Is finicky a word? Can I have a quick poll? Yes, if you think finicky is a word. Okay, cool. So the two English guys and the Scot. I believe you now. Cool. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about a due diligence product for how to do due diligence for product and engineering teams. When you want to sort of start selling into enterprise, larger organizations, this is one of those parts of the sales process that feels a bit weird because it's not really selling anymore. You're not selling the value and so on and so forth. You're having to figure out, like, how do I get through these other teams, these other people who aren't really invested in the value that I'm trying to deliver to this company. They don't care about the commercials. They don't care about the value. They just want, like, have a process to complete. So what does it look like when you're especially going through this for the first time? What are some of the tips and tricks? And how can you do that without slowing your company down? So hi, I'm Michael. That's a picture of me. I'm a Brit. It's lovely to be here in Austin. I'm VP of Engineering and Data at a company called Bud. So we do financial data enrichment, transactional enrichment for primarily banks, but also fintechs, other sort of FSIs. And we do that to help people sort of understand their customers. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. If you want to hear about that, come chat to like me or someone at the booth later. I'll be more than happy to chat to you about that. What will we be chatting about today? So first of all, like, what does this due diligence process look like? Secondly, how do you set yourself up for success in that before you're at a point with a client being like, hey, where's your SOC 2? And you're like, what the hell is a SOC 2? And thirdly, how do you then get through that process? How are you going to pass that process? So throughout all of this, you're thinking, okay, my objective here, I want to sell into enterprise, right? Like, I want to be able to sell into these big corporates. But you actually, that's not your entire objective. You also want to maintain balance while doing that. And something that a lot of companies will do is they'll have a big, large enterprise come along and it'll be your first client, and they will want to sort of stamp all over you with process. They will say, hey, you need to be doing this, 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 and this. And something you have to be really careful about is you don't just want to say yes to all of those things. Because if you do, you put yourself at risk at almost just turning into a large enterprise company, right? And that's not what you want to be able to achieve. You want to be able to keep what makes you, you. But you want to be able to find that alignment. You want to be able to continue to operate fluidly. You want to be able to continue to iterate and develop. You want to be able to continue to move at a fast pace. So how do we marry these two objectives together? You want to be able to satisfy the enterprise client requirements, but you also need to remain what makes you a startup, a scale-up. So when we sort of start to get into this, and before you can sort of start to approach, like, how do I go about doing this? Probably the most important thing to think about is, why do these corporates do this due diligence? Like, what's the point? Like, why are they making me fill out all these forms? And there are three kind of primary reasons. The first one is they are normally very heavily regulated entities. And that doesn't just mean necessarily like financial regulators. Sometimes that means like data protection regulators. Sometimes that means like there's a whole bunch of other different regulators and regulations that they might be subject to. The second is when you're a large business that has a working business model, something you have to think about is risk. Because ultimately, while you want to, as a business, like, grow and can make more money and reduce your costs and optimize and improve your business, when you already have a substantial, successful business, your number one priority is making sure you don't sacrifice that. You don't want to lose what you already have, which means you have to think about risk. Hey, if I go and introduce this, what's the potential things that could happen out of the result of that? Like, how could this potentially destroy my business? And the third one is, they also actually care about how you operate as a company. And they want to see how compatible it is with their own value system and what their own objectives are. So to satisfy regulators, what does that kind of mean? When you're trying to satisfy regulators, it means you need to understand what are those regulators looking for. And realistically, and especially in the US market, that means you need to check some boxes. So you need to understand what those boxes are that you need to check. Managing and understanding risk. What does that mean? It means you need to reassure and provide some comfort to them. It means that you need to be able to give them a sense of, hey, this isn't a big risk. Working with us, working with me, is not going to mean the end of your business. It's not going to mean a massive fine from a regulator. It's not going to mean a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying that your business is complete trash, right? And that means that you need to be able to understand, how can I provide them with that reassurance? How can I provide them, how can I build that trust that the risk is minimal, right? You're trying to minimize and mitigate the risk. And the third one is about essentially compatibility with their values and objectives. Now, what that means is you need to be compatible with their values. It means you need to be compatible with their objectives. And if they're a business that's trying to prevent risk, that's trying to, and the reason why a lot of these enterprises might seemingly move slowly is intentional, right? So how can you fit into that model as a company that perhaps is, your whole thing is moving fast, being able to iterate, being able to find product market fit and so on. But it means that, most of all, you need to find a way to be compatible with those values. So, what does then this due diligence look like, right, for anyone who hasn't seen it before? And if you have been through this before, I apologize. So the first step is quite often a massive spreadsheet, right? And this spreadsheet will vary. The one that I've got a weird, tiny, unreadable screenshot of there is sort of a standardized questionnaire. Don't spend time trying to prepare against the standardized questionnaires, because almost every large corporate enterprise has their own specific questionnaire, and they all look completely different, but they're all kind of asking the same things. And you've got organizations like CSA, which is what this one is, CSA Star, that will try and come up with standardized ones, and they'll sell that to their clients. And for the idea of making everyone's life easier, no one does that, because there's always someone who realistically is like, oh yeah, but I've got that other question I want to ask, or I want to ask it in a different way at that organization. So first of all, you have this big spreadsheet that you have to fill in a bunch of answers to. And sometimes they're really simple. Sometimes they're like yes or no. Sometimes they always require a text response to each question. And sometimes they're asking for evidence as well. When you're looking through this, if it's a yes-no response, easy, simple, they're the quickest ones to complete. And let's be honest, the ones we all like the most. When you have ones that require a text response, sometimes you just need to say yes. And something that I've seen happen a lot is where someone insists on writing 3 paragraphs for every single answer. Sometimes you need 3 paragraphs to explain what you're doing. Sometimes you just need to say yes. And sometimes say yes, and this is referenced in our InfoSec policy or whatever, right? So think about how long your answers actually need to be. When it asks you for evidence, there are 2 different types of evidence that you're kind of looking at. One is a policy. So policies set out what you aim to be doing, how you, and what your kind of controls are. So in a document, it might say, yes, we, every single deployment to production goes through a pull request and 2 people approve it. Now, what they might also then ask for is proof that you're doing that thing. So for example, that might be a screenshot of a pull request where that's been the case. We'll talk about standards in a minute, but that's a nice way of being able to, instead of having to provide evidence for every single control, basically say, hey, we have SOC 2. We have an auditor who's already tested all of this in a lot more detail than realistically you're doing right now. I once had a bank, and they wanted evidence that we were encrypting the customer data on a per customer level. And we were like, how do you want evidence of this? And they were like, can you show us the code? So we screenshotted a single line of code that showed that we were taking a variable called customer data and encrypting it, and then using that. And they were like, okay, cool. It's bizarre sometimes what the evidence is necessary. Think about this exercise is a lot more of the checkboxing side of things. The second thing is you'll normally have a call or two, right? And sometimes this might be one call and then you're done. Sometimes it might be 20. And sometimes they might be spread over a course of 6 months. Sometimes they might be like just a single call in a week and you're done. Now, in this call, they are trying to get to the bottom of a few things as quickly as possible. They're trying to get an understanding of your overarching platform, like how everything fits together. Quite often, people in the DD team have no idea what you're delivering. They don't even know, don't know your product. Sometimes they're badly briefed. So you need to go into it thinking, okay, these people have no idea why they're in the room, what's going on. I need to give them an intro to my product, the value it's providing, how it works. You know, okay, we're doing a dashboard, we're receiving data via APIs, and then they'll follow up questions. But the other thing about these Zoom calls is this is where you are trying to demonstrate to them that they can trust you. You're demonstrating your competence. And that means that these calls are really important. If you are, especially when it's your earlier clients, this is the kind of thing where your CTO should be on the call. It's the kind of thing where your VP of engineering or someone should be on the call, because you need to be able to answer those questions and you need to be able to answer them with confidence. Because if you start being like, I don't know what we do there or so on, then you're not portraying that like confidence. You're not going to be instilling trust that you know what you're doing. So have a think, okay, who are the best people in our organization to be able to talk to this, who know this information in their heads and can talk to it really fluently? Ultimately, these are the people who are, hopefully, the senior people in your organization who have probably put into place a lot of these different policies. But ultimately, they're also the people that the other side, that the client, will want to be saying, okay, you know, do we trust that this CTO like knows what he's doing, that this organization has got good tech practices and so on. And the third element is standards. So they'll probably ask for various things to have been audited, to have been, like you to have gone through pen tests and so on and so forth. And I'll talk through what a couple of those mean right now. But one of the big advantages of this is that when you achieve these accreditations, you've normally been audited by someone. So in some of them, that means someone coming in for a day, going through a bunch of paperwork, asking to see some evidence. Sometimes with SOC 2, it's like type 2, it's a much more broad sort of thing where actually they're being like, okay, I want to see the offboarding records of every single one of your employees in the past 6 months. And if there are any exceptions, it's going in the report. So sometimes it's a lot more intense. But ultimately, the purpose of that is to be able to understand and sort of someone has actually tested that you're doing what you say you do. So some standards that you may or may not be familiar with, I'll kind of just talk through. The first one is ISO 27001. So ISO 27001 is about how you manage your information security program. So, okay, these are our different processes, and these are how we manage policies. This is how we update policies, and so on and so forth. There are also a number of sort of specific controls that it does dictate to you. They call them Annex A controls, for no particular reason other than they're contained in a part of the standard called Annex A, which is just unhelpful. You'd call them something that actually makes sense to other human beings, but whatever. So this is sort of around like how you structure, like how you go about doing InfoSec. You then have SOC 2. So SOC 2 is a number of sort of very specific controls. It's less around like how you manage your InfoSec program. It's more about what you're doing. So it's things like, do you have a vulnerability scanner running? Does your board review like your stance on InfoSec? Do you do your pen testing at least once every 6 months and so on and so forth, right? It's a lot more prescriptive. And then it's about actually, the testing of those controls is a lot more detailed. Like, have you actually gone and offboarded every single one of your employees correctly within the correct SLAs over the past 6 months? Whereas ISO 27001 is more about, hey, this is the process we do when we offboard some of our employees, and here, look, here's one that we did where they followed that particular procedure. And then finally, you might hear something called CREST. So one of the key things is, and this is less about like your processes and controls, this is someone coming along and doing a pen test on your platform. So hiring an external agency, and they try and find holes, security holes, compromises in your platform. In practice, The vast majority, some of these will be accredited by Crest, some of them won't be. I would recommend getting a Crest one done because pen tests are really expensive. And what you don't want to do is go and get your platform pen tested and then go to a DD with a client and they're like, well, we need a Crest accredited pen tester. And then you have to go through the whole thing again. Especially if you're a startup, like these things are expensive. So, how do we set ourselves up for success? The number one thing that you should be thinking, should they actually trust me, right? They're a massive enterprise. They have potentially billions of dollars at stake, right? If you think about the deposits, more than billions for some of these organizations, right? And before you start thinking about how should I convince them that they should trust me, you should be thinking, should they be trusting me? Like, do I deserve, am I going to cause them problems? Is my platform actually going to be reliable enough? Or actually, are there chances that I have some security vulnerabilities in there? And the first thing that you need to be convincing and getting to a point is where you're like, actually, you know what? Yes, they can trust me. Because if you can't believe that, and I don't mean just sort of, oh yeah, they can trust me, I know what I'm doing. I mean really thinking about this question, right? Getting into a room with some of your senior engineers and being like, hey, what are our biggest things that are likely to cause a platform to go down? What are our concerns? What are our worries? Get it all out in the open in that room. And then ask yourselves that question. Do I deserve to be trusted in this situation? Because if the answer is no, that's fine, but you need to fix that before you can then start to convince someone else that they should be able to trust you. So, we get to this point, you've hopefully got to a place where you think, okay, yeah, I deserve to be trusted. And you want to implement some policies and make some changes. Now, we talked about sort of like alignment of values and so on, but the first thing is you don't want to become a bureaucracy, right? You don't want to sacrifice your own speed and so on to like be able to meet these requirements. Now, when you're a large organization, and anyone who works with a large organization or works for one, I can see a couple of JP Morganers in the audience, these organizations introduce friction intentionally, right? Like that friction isn't there by like unintentionally. And don't get me wrong, sometimes they might have too much that's unintentional and just happens over time. But these organizations have introduced friction for a reason. They've introduced friction because ultimately it means that they are less likely to make a mistake that they feel like could have bad consequences, right? Whether or not that holds true is a debate. However, the friction exists for a reason. Now, you as a startup or a scale-up, you're coming in being like, hey, we have no friction. Our devs just deploy through to production like 100 times a day. Like they just click a button and it just goes out. Isn't that wonderful? And they're like, no, that's not wonderful. Because like, how do you make sure those changes aren't breaking stuff, right? How do you make sure that developer's laptop hasn't been compromised and that they're not pushing out vulnerabilities into the software that's processing our data? So you are working with an organization that has intentionally introduced friction. You don't necessarily have that same friction, but you don't want to introduce that friction in the same kind of way. So the question is, how can you essentially align values, but without introducing that same friction? How can you achieve the same objectives and outcomes without doing the same thing? Because ultimately, you still need to align values. You still need to align on the ultimate thing that you're both trying to achieve. The platform isn't going to go down and cause you, like we've all seen what happened with CrowdStrike, Delta, et cetera, and everyone else that was impacted by that, right? In this situation, they're Delta, you're CrowdStrike. Delta is like going to be going to CrowdStrike and being like, hey, how can we make sure that, yes, CrowdStrike, we understand that you're going to be pushing out updates frequently because you need to do that because you're a security platform. How can we make sure that you're not going to brick every single one of our computer systems and therefore causing us, I can't remember what they said, but I think it was like billions of dollars worth of damages. So what are their values? What are their objectives? Like, let's delve into that a little bit. The first one is they want to understand that your system is unlikely to cause unexpected business disruption from avoidable situations. So to unpack that a little bit, they know that no system is ever going to be up 100% of the time, right? And it's going to work 100% of the time. However, this is all about risk mitigation. It's about making that as least likely as possible. I think obviously I'm from the UK, so this is a UK stat, but something like the Bank of England has like certain stats around, like they expect something to like break like once every 100 years, for example, and that's like their the least likely risk scenario. It's something that's happened once every 100 years. For most of us in that room, that's only like 1 and a bit lifetimes, right? So it's about making it really unlikely, not impossible. It's about being able to align that with expectations. So if you go to your client and it's only a system that needs to work in business hours, 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, you're Americans, so maybe 8 till 6. I think you work longer hours these days, or you say you do. So it doesn't really matter if it goes down at 3 a.m., right? So long as that's an aligned expectation between the two parties, right? Business disruption. Now, does it matter if like one every 1,000 API requests like results in an error? Like, is that actually a problem? Is that going to disrupt their business? And that's something you need to figure out, and then you need to align on it. So, is it actually going to disrupt their business, or is it just going to be like look like something which, as a software engineer, we're like, okay, it's not great. You saw an error. And then finally, the bit is avoidable. Like some things are just unavoidable, right? Right now, you could say that, hey, we host our servers in the UK and in the US. And you could have a hurricane hit the data center in the US, and you could have flooding at the data center in the UK happen at exactly the same moment. And it's like, you know what? Like, A, that's unlikely to happen. But also, like, it's kind of hard to avoid, like, the fact or nuclear war breaks out, or whatever, like, one of these things, right? If nuclear war breaks out, the chances that your affordability credit risk, like, monitoring system is going to survive, like, probably not that high, right? So, breaking that down a little bit, and the 3 main things that they'll look for on that sort of business disruption point. First of all, they want to understand how you manage change. So, if you go and deploy like a new feature or a bug fix to the platform, is that likely to break it? Is that likely to cause this business disruption? But also, is someone able to perhaps change the platform that could introduce a security vulnerability, whether intentionally or unintentionally? So how do you manage change? And if you start talking about change management, it sounds like all big and scary and corporate. Like, but if you start thinking about this as a developer, it's, okay, well, how do you deploy something to production? Like, what does that process look like? Okay, well, I do a pull request, and then like someone looks at that pull request, and they review it and approve it, hopefully. Maybe they come back to me with some comments, push that through, and that goes through a bunch of like QA processes. Some might be automated, some might be manual, and that gets through to production, right? Like, that's your process. That's change management, right? You've had a couple of people like look at it there. You've essentially had an approval process. So thinking about what these things mean in your day-to-day. The second one is incident management, like resilience, scalability. So this is like, is the platform likely to just break itself? And if it does, what happens? So when we're thinking about incident management, resilience, scalability, do you have, actually, I'm coming to this in a bit, so I'll go into more detail in a moment. And the third one is, and this is actually less about product and engineering teams, but is your business going to continue to operate? When you're a startup and you've existed for 6 months, you've maybe just got a seed round or a Series A, and you're having a conversation with, I don't know, Wells Fargo. They're like, well, how do I know you're still going to be here in 18 months? How do I know you're not going to go bankrupt? Like, you are currently burning runway. You're not profitable. You won't be profitable with this contract either. Who's to say that your business won't just disappear? That's an important thing to think about. Do you have the competence in your business to do what I expect of you? Have you got a leadership team? Have you got like the right technical people to deliver like a good quality service? When I joined Bud, we'd just sort of done our Series A. Part of my role I was brought in to do was to mature our engineering. One of my team who sort of ran data was ex-Goldman Sachs. Every time that we were talking to big corporates, like we would mention that we had a guy in the team who was ex-Goldman Sachs. And they were like, oh, cool, yeah, so you guys get how it's done. Like those kind of things make a difference because you're demonstrating competence. You're demonstrating you have the experience in your team. And sometimes you can do that by referencing other clients, other big enterprise clients. Sometimes you have to think about who do you have in your organization that you can essentially, that have the CVs or have the right presence in a call and so on, that they can talk to these things and demonstrate that competence. So that's all about disruption. The second thing that they want to know about is they want to know that you're probably not going to get hacked. And it's kind of that simple, right? No system is ever 100% secure, right? Like 100%. But they want to know that you are going to be doing a good job and that is very unlikely to ever happen. And the two ways that they want to test this is, are you following best security practices? And when you're filling out that questionnaire, that's basically what you're showing them. They're saying, hey, here is a security best practice. You're doing that, right? And they're looking for you to say yes. We'll talk about that in a moment. And they're basically their way of saying, are you doing all these things that reasonably I would expect you to do to make sure that you're not going to get hacked? And secondly, they're testing, do you know all of these things that you should be doing? Do you know like already without me having to tell you, right? They don't want to be suddenly consulting you on what like good security looks like. And sometimes you'll go into this conversation being like, you know what, I know my security is better than yours. It doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. Like, you need to be able to convince them that A, you are competent, so that's the point of like, yes, I know like what I'm talking about in this space, but you also need to be able to demonstrate that you are like enacting that through your processes already, because they don't know that. They have no way of knowing that. And then secondly, how do you validate that? So how do they know that, okay, you might think you know what you're doing. You might interview well, right? But how do you make sure that you don't have a whole bunch of security holes in your system? How do you make sure that your controls are working? And by controls, like control is essentially a process that you're doing to make sure everything. So a control might be whenever someone is offboarded, an employee is offboarded, we remove their access within 24 hours, for example. So how do you validate that? Are you getting frequent security audits from ISO or SOC 2 and so on? Are you having people do pen tests of your platform? Are you using vulnerability scanners to see any dependencies that you might be using that might have vulnerabilities and so on? So how do you validate that beyond just your own expertise and internal? So when we're thinking about being a startup, there's this phrase that we have, right? Move fast and break things. And you should continue to move fast and break things. That is part of what makes you you. However, if you turn around to a big bank and say, oh yeah, we move fast and break things, they're going to be like, yeah, but I don't want my stuff broken, right? I don't want anything broken. That sounds really bad. Like, that sounds like the complete opposite of what I'm looking for. They want you to maybe move fast, but they don't want you to break things. So I would suggest taking another turn of like this particular phrase. You want to be able to move fast, not because you've got someone in a corner who's just pushing code straight to production through FTP servers or whatever, right? And doing whatever they feel like. You want to make sure you're moving fast and able to do that due to great tooling. So what does that mean? It means, okay, cool, yeah, you can get something through to production within 30 minutes, but you can do that because you have incredible automated test suites, because you have like all the right sort of guardrails set up, because you maybe have canarying on in production. That means that if you don't, like if you do roll out a change, then it's not an issue and so on. Like having that great tooling enables you to move fast. You're not just moving fast because you want to, or because you're I don't know if this expression translates well into Texas, but like in the UK, we would say being like a cowboy. It means kind of going wild. That's not what you want to portray, right? And break things, but with minimal impact. You can break things so long as you don't cause that business disruption, right? So this is where things like canarying come in. This is where things like failover come in. Like, okay, I'm going to deploy a change, but I'm going to deploy it to 0.1% of API calls. And what I've agreed with them is that 99.9% of API calls will pass, right? Or I've got some internal retry logic set up. So I know that when I deploy that change, if it starts causing problems, it's only going to impact a tiny percentage of traffic. I will immediately see that. Maybe the system will even roll it back automatically, right? Now, the one thing I would say, there's a huge amount of tooling to make all of this kind of stuff work. And it can sound quite daunting. Don't build it all yourselves. Like, go and find other providers, go and find other tools like that you can use as off the shelf as possible to achieve this. If you have all of your software engineers focused on, hey, how can we improve our canarying processes, or so on and so forth, you're not going to spend any time building your actual product, and you're going to fail as a company. Because as a startup, scale up, you need to be able to move fast, you need to find product market fit, to be able to develop out like your client base and so on to survive, especially post-zero interest rates, right? So don't move fast and break things. Move fast due to great tooling, and break things, but with minimal impact. Because you don't want to slow yourself down. There was a really great talk that was here last year by Charity Majors. She did a whole talk dedicated to this very specific topic of inside of regulated environments, how can you make sure you're still doing modern development practices, right? So how can you make sure you're still being able to do like continuous deployments and so on and so forth? I'm not going to go into that in a huge amount of detail because she did 60 minutes on it last year. She's a great speaker, great talk, super smart. So just go and watch that. The link is down there to watch that for more detail. But what I am going to do is talk through those two different areas. So we talked about like security, we talked through resilience, and we'll talk through what are some of the key things that they're ultimately going to be looking at, and what should you be preparing for right now so that when you get there, you're in a good place. Because it's much easier to start implementing these processes now than at the end when you're actually at that point in a sales process. And you're like, hey, actually, could you just give us 12 months? Because we need to go away, rebuild all of our processes, go and get all of these standards and accreditations, and then we'll work with you, because then they'll be like, okay, cool, I'm going with your competitor, bye. And that's really sad when that happens, if that happens. So resilience, the number one thing. How can you prevent regressions? How can you prevent bugs or defects, as like I guess they would be called in more corporate terms? So this is when you're thinking, okay, well, how can I make sure I'm not going to break the system? How can I make sure that I have like the right testing in place? And again, going back to move fast and break things, you want to do that in a way where it doesn't cost you a huge amount of time. If every time you want to deploy to production, you suddenly have to spend like 5 days of manual QA time on it, you're like killing your business because you're slowing down. You need to be able to find ways to move things, but you need to use tooling to be able to help you get there. So think about, okay, and this is going to be one of the questions. When you deploy things, how do you make sure that that isn't going to contain bugs and issues? What does that process look like? Sometimes that'll be like they'll ask that in a way that might not be obvious. It might be things like, describe your software development lifecycle. That's what they're looking for. Your incident management processes. So, okay, production, suddenly there's an outage. Every single API call is returning a 500. What do you do in that situation? Now, you probably already have a process that you do in that situation, right? It might be really informal though. It might be like, oh, we know if production goes down, then like that person gets like a paging phone, and then we all get in a huddle in a room, and then we figure it out and we fix it. They don't want to know that you all get in a huddle in a room and fix it, right? Like that doesn't sound particularly professional. So think about what you would already do. How can you work to codify that into a process, into a documented process, into a procedure? And sometimes there's tooling that you can use. Like we use Instant.io. It's a fantastic tool. Would highly recommend for incident management and managing that process and codifying it. But what happens when it goes wrong? Think about it. Have you ever practiced what happens when something goes wrong? Have you ever practiced that process? And that has two advantages, right? One, you're basically training members of the team and helping them be more familiar with that process so that when it happens, it's a lot easier to deal with. But also, it's around being able to improve that process. So, we realize that when that thing goes wrong, it's really hard to figure out why Redis is down because we don't have a dashboard for that, or so on and so forth. So you can improve your processes that go along with it. Talk about that. You might already be running those practices. Are you writing them down? Is there a document at the end when you've just gone and done like one of those game days or whatever you call it that says, this is what we did and these are the learnings that we had? If not, next time you do one, write it in a document, because that's the kind of thing that they're looking for. How do you evidence these things as well? Scaling. This will always come up. How do you make sure that you're going to be able to handle the amount of traffic that's necessary? And if you think about all the reasons why a system might fail, that's what's leading into all these things, right? Bugs, defects, how do you prevent regressions? Change introducing failure. Incident management process. Okay, well, it could be stateful issues, it could be any one of these other different things. How do you deal with it? Scaling. Load, like the number one sort of variable on a system that is constantly kind of impacting you. So they want to understand how do you regularly review capacity and capacity management? And your instinct might be like, well, we're on the cloud, like it just does what it needs to, right? That's not the answer that they really want to hear. What they want to hear is like, oh yeah, we've tested this. Like we've tested up to this number. We regularly, on a regular basis, we review like what those numbers look like. We make sure we've tested to that. We make sure that we're comfortable with that. We make sure that our Google quotas, because like even on the cloud, you have that like little tab where you have quotas of the maximum number of CPUs that you can be collecting at any one time are. So having a think about that and what that means, and then ideally you have auto-scaling in place, right? You don't have to, but recommended. Monitoring. So now we're starting to think about how do you make sure the system is working, and especially when you deploy a change, how do you make sure that you know that that change worked or it didn't work? How do you make sure that when something goes wrong at 3 a.m., someone finds out about it and then goes to fix it? And failover and backups. Every single time there'll be a question on failover and there'll be a question on backups. In a cloud world, how many of you think about like, how is my Cloud SQL database being updated and so on? Quite rarely. It's not one of those things that immediately occurs to you, but you need to understand what that looks like. Especially like, and if you're working with a database like Cassandra or something distributed, backups kind of seem weird to think about, or BigQuery. But you need to understand, okay, this is how often we do backups. This is what restoring from them looks like. This is what failover looks like. You're running a Kubernetes cluster. You're running it in 3 zones. But are you running all your pods in 3 zones? That's your failover strategy, right, between zones. If you are thinking about like multi-region, like how does that work? How are you serving traffic to multi-regions? All of that, just translating that into that kind of corporate speak. Securing the platform. First of all, just encrypt everything. Like, this will always be a question, is your stuff encrypted? The answer to that should always be yes. If you have 2 services, are they talking to each other over HTTP or HTTPS? Sometimes it's that simple. Just do it with HTTPS when you start out. It makes life so much easier, and there's no reason really not to. Encrypt traffic over the network. If you're using disks or any kind of storage, just make sure you have that base level of encryption in there, right? Sometimes there's additional encryption, like row level and so on. That's more about like value, and that's more about specific to your use case. But just make sure you've got all the cloud defaults like set there, and that you're encrypting traffic between services. Managing your secrets. So you need to think about how you manage things like credentials, certificates, and so on. And my biggest request to you is don't jump to Vault on this, right? Like Vault is an awesome piece of technology. I love it. However, it's more likely to cause you outages than it is to actually like protect anything when you're sort of in those earlier stages. So think about what is actually the solution I need to do this, right? And make sure you're thinking about availability as well as security. It's a great book on this by Google, which is basically about the intersection of SRE and security. Would highly recommend a read. But think about how you're managing those secrets data. You're not just pushing them into a GitHub repository and deploying from that or whatever, right? Pen testing, I already kind of talked about this. Super important, but it's also really expensive. So be targeted. You don't just want to do it to tick a box. You want to do it so that you can actually gain value from it and understand, is my system secure, and use that to gain more trust. Managing vulnerabilities. So who has a JavaScript project? Probably has like 1,000 vulnerabilities in it right now, all from third-party dependencies. The question is, do they actually matter, right? Like, if it is on a system that is locked down to a VPN and only accessible by employees, and all employees that have access to the system have access to all the data in it, like, how big an issue really is that? So first of all, understand where are third-party dependencies that matter, where are the ones that are like the ones I need, and then how much do I need to keep an eye on it, and then how am I going to manage those vulnerabilities? You do not want all of your software engineers spending all their time updating their JavaScript vulnerabilities, because, right, that's just not a productive way to spend time. You want to be able to move fast, you want to be able to move fast in your domain. So come up with a strategy. How are we going to identify what those vulnerabilities are that matter, those third-party dependencies? How can we keep up to date, but without it costing us too much time? Again, think about tooling. And then think about the ones that can really hurt you, right? If you use Cassandra and you're like, okay, or Kubernetes maybe, be like, okay, if there's one of the vulnerabilities in that, that's going to really screw me. So maybe I should just subscribe to the security advisory's mailing list and attach that to PagerDuty so that when there's an advisory, it pages me and then I can quickly look at it and understand and triage and so on, right? Being able to talk about that kind of stuff is really key to being able to think about your third parties. Who has access to your data and why? Say that you have a dashboard product, and in it you can go in there and view like the credit reports of consumers. Does the CEO of your company have a login that just lets them go and view any of those? If so, why? Is that part of the CEO's job? Does he need that access, or she? Probably not, right? Like that's probably not in their job description. Think about who has access to data, and then flip yourself onto the other side, flip yourself onto the client side. Because at that bank, not everyone will have access to all the data. And they'll be like, why do those people all need access to the data? Why do developers need access to the data? Do your developers have access to production databases, even read-only? Why? Why do they need to be able to view that data? Why can't they operate off of logs? Because theirs do, right? How can you make sure that you only have access to what you need, but in a way that doesn't slow you down? And often that comes down to logs, encryption, metrics, being really in a really good place. And actually, that can make you a lot faster to respond to incidents as well. Third parties, did you do due diligence on them? Say you use Google Cloud, and you're working with HSBC. HSBC, Google Cloud have a really good relationship. They will still say, what due diligence did you do on Google Cloud? And they don't expect a response of, well, the HSBC CIO is on their homepage talking about how great their security is. That's not an acceptable answer, right? Then what they're expecting you to say is, well, we've reviewed their SOC 2, we do that every 6 months, and so on and so forth. So think about the third parties you're using. Think about how trustworthy they are. Think about if they're well-known brands. It makes a massive difference. Authentication and peer reviews. I'm a little bit behind on time, so I'm just going to kind of step through. Think about all of this stuff early. The earlier you do it, the easier it is in order to be able to implement these processes, and the less painful it feels when you then have to potentially make changes. But you also want to be able to make it as easy as possible to do this with minimal effort. You don't want to be spending your time thinking about controls and GitHub approval policies and so on and so forth, right? These are two platforms. They can automate a bunch of this stuff for you. If you don't have a compliance person, maybe use one of these. Otherwise, spreadsheets can sometimes do it. Just a list of all the things okay, we have this control. This is what we're doing in this space. Otherwise, also as a CTO, you're going to spend most of your time going through spreadsheets from clients, asking you questions. Enabling other people to be able to answer those questions is a really key part of this. So passing this due diligence, I mentioned about these standards. SOC 2, normally required in the US, less so in Europe. ISO, it's the other way around. So ISO is normally required in Europe, whereas SOC 2 is more optional. So it really kind of depends on your market. Pen testing, every single person will ask you for pen testing. So that should probably be your first kind of point of call. You also need to do pen tests in order to get these two. So this order, recommended. The final thing I kind of want to talk about is speaking their language. So when they ask you a question, your job is to say yes, right? But they will ask questions in weird and wonderful ways. And sometimes it would be really ridiculous to do it in the way that they've described. But it's still your job to help them check that box. It's still your job to help them say yes. So a good example of that is say, for example, you have this requirement, and it says all applications must require two-factor authentication. And you're like, well, it doesn't require two-factor authentication. However, application access is only via a VPN. And in order to authenticate to that VPN, there is two-factor authentication. And we have to approve the devices to be able to join onto that VPN. So actually, it's three-factor authentication. Yes, the application doesn't have two-factor authentication. But what you're saying is what you do instead, or why it's not relevant to you, right? If they're like, oh, well, do you do single sign-on? It's like, no, because it's an API integration and there's no like users authenticating onto it, right? So it's not relevant. Your job is to help them say yes. Don't push that onto them because they won't help you, right? They just won't, especially if they don't really understand your product. Your job is to help them say yes, right? Never lie. Never, ever, ever lie. You will end up in jail, right? But the key thing here is that you are trying to help them figure out, okay, what's their need, what's their desire, what's their objective, how do I help them say yes? And all of this, to go back to what we said at the very beginning, every time you're filling out a spreadsheet, every call that you're on, every bit of like audit or standard or anything you're doing, you are trying to show your competence and you're trying to create trust. That's what due diligence is all about. It's helping them to understand and trust you. You need to make sure you deserve to be trusted. You need to make sure you are competent and have that competence in-house. And then you need to think about, how can I display that? How can I help them understand how competent we are? Cool. So we chatted about what due diligence looks like, how to set yourself up for success, and how to pass it, hopefully. And keeping in mind these two objectives. You're trying to sell into enterprise, but you don't want to slow yourself down. Questions? We've overrun by like 3 minutes, so I might get told off, but like, let's go with it anyway.
I've got a question about the sequencing of getting certified. Since obviously it's a big undertaking for a Series A or a C company to do that.
Yeah.
The way I tend to approach it is you don't want to be caught flat-footed like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily want to jump in and get SOC 2 up front, because that's going to just obliterate any of your available capacity.
Yeah.
What's your thinking on the sequencing?
Sure. So the question for anyone who didn't hear it is, doing something like SOC 2 can require a lot of effort, resource, etc. When is a good time to be able to start doing that without obliterating your sort of internal resources? My advice is, right at the very beginning, understand what SOC 2 controls look like, right? And as you are naturally developing out your business's processes, thinking either, how is this going to align with that in the future? Or, hey, I'm giving myself a bit of debt here, and I need to do this bit of work later on, right? Don't go and get your SOC 2 before you need it, but you should be in a position where you know exactly how much work it is to get it, and therefore be able to plan, okay, we're going into this sales cycle. This client's 100% going to require it. We think we're going to win this deal. Maybe now is the time to start looking at it because we know it's going to take 3 months, 4 months, whatever. I think the key thing is, don't necessarily start implementing stuff right at the very beginning, but you should be thinking about it. So you should be thinking, okay, cool. For change management or whatever, or for deployment, we want to make sure that when we're deploying, we have like tests and so on, like automated. You don't want to get to the point where you're about to sign the client, and you're like, okay, we need SOC 2, and you already don't have that test suite stuff in place. You want to think, okay, well, we should probably start building some of these tests as we're going along, but maybe there's this bit of debt here of stuff that's not covered. What does that look like? What does perhaps hiring or time look like in order to be able to get there? So that you constantly have that idea of what it looks like. Because yeah, don't do SOC 2 immediately on your Series A. That's a bad idea. Unless you're about to sign a HSBC, in which case, yes, 100%, just hurry up. Because it'll be a chunk of time. Any more questions? I think we've got time for maybe 2 more, and then they'll probably come and kick me out with a boot up my ass. Alan?
Yes, it's on the other side of this due diligence, sort of like it was a fantastic talk, sort of like a lot of maturity in that, really good to see. But my question is, how do you gain the knowledge of what to divulge? You mentioned earlier on about yes, no answers, and like this one line of code sort of thing. How do you go about
Yeah, the question there was how do you go about gaining the knowledge to understand like, how much detail to put and what to share. You don't want to share too much, right? Like, don't be at a point where you're suddenly sharing code bases and so on and so forth. Like, that's getting to a point where it's too far. And you can push back on some of this stuff, where they're like, hey, we want this evidence. You could be like, do you really need that in order to be able to, like, ascertain? I would say part of this is experience and, like, working with someone who's done it before. And if you don't have anyone in your team who's ever been on either side before, go and chat to friends. Like, I don't know if any of you are part of sort of like developer Slacks or CTO Slacks and so on, like asking other people, getting a sense check from friends can be a really valuable way of doing that. The other flip side is just look at your answer and think, okay, go back to the principles we were talking about. I'm trying to inspire trust and create trust and show competence. Is my answer going to damage that trust? Are they going to think I'm no longer competent, right? But the second one is, am I giving them enough to be able to inspire that trust? You want to give enough to inspire trust, not so little that you're going to damage that. But you also don't want to hand over your code base. Like, never hand over your code base. Don't hand over your IP. If it gets to a point where they're asking you to do that, go and chat to a bunch of friends and sense check. But the TLDR is probably no, don't do that. It's a hard question to answer, and I think part of it is experience and doing it a few times, but yeah. Cool. Maybe one more super quick question, if you, like 60 seconds. Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'll be around afterwards if you've got any more questions. Yeah, and